Hi again, I'm Lindsay Larris, the LA Regional Director, and I'm going to be moderating this third panel on the environmental perspective on CAFOs. Unfortunately, one of our panelists had a personal emergency and couldn't make it today, Lynn Henning. So we have our two other panelists who are both great and going to cover some of Lynn's materials. So on our panel today are Kathy Hessler, I'm sorry about that. She is a clinical professor of law and the Animal Law Clinic Director at Lewis and Clark Law School. Kathy Hessler is the only faculty member hired to teach animal law in a law school, which is great. She was previously a board member with Animal Legal Defense Fund and helped to found the Animal Law Committee of the Cuyahoga County Bar. Thank you. Additionally, she was the chair and a founder of the Animal Law section of the American Association of Law Schools and the Balance in Legal Education section. She was also a co-chair of the Clinical Legal Education section of the AALS and is on the board of the Center for Teaching Peace. Professor Hessler has co-authored many materials as well as books on animal law, including the article Mediating Animal Law Matters, which was featured in a journal when I was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Animal Law and Ethics at UPenn, and it was cited in a Texas Court of Appeals case. So that is very impressive. She's been teaching animal law since 2001, and animal law concepts is a part of nonviolence classes beginning in 1989. At Lewis and Clark, Professor Hessler is the faculty advisor to SALDF and Outlaw, coaches the animal law moot court teams, and has been an advisor to the Animal Law Journal since 1998. Professor Hessler lectures widely on animal law and animal law education issues in the US and internationally. And next to Professor Hessler is Eli Holmes, who is an attorney at the Blue River Law in Eugene, Oregon. Prior to starting Blue River Law, Eli was a staff attorney for the Center for Food Safety, which I believe Leslie has mentioned. They worked together, where she managed the center's animal factory civil litigation and administrative docket, addressing issues ranging from potentially harmful animal feed additives to enforcement actions against animal factories. Eli continues to represent the Center for Food Safety on an of-counsel basis in a RCRA lawsuit, and RCRA is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and I'm sure Eli will be talking more about this case. It's a case known as CARE and CFS versus Cow Palace. It's the first time the federal court found a violation of RCRA based on CAFOs for manure management. And Eli, for several years before being on the Center for Food Safety, Eli practiced family law and probate litigation, where she specialized in high net worth divorces and complicated will contests. Eli is on the board of directors of Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides and is a member of Public Justice Foundation. Eli is admitted to practice in Oregon and Massachusetts. So I will turn it over right now to Professor Hessler to start her presentation.
Thank you, Lindsay, and ALDF and USC. It's delightful to be here, and thank you all for staying. I know it's kind of a taxing day, and there's a lot of challenging information. Hopefully this won't be too stressful, and I like to end on high notes, so maybe not as cute as Leslie did. That set the bar pretty high. But I'm delighted to be here and share some thoughts with you. Greetings from Lewis and Clark. This is Lewis and Clark. I have the privilege of working there. We just got named the 8th most beautiful place to go to graduate school, woohoo! Which is actually really nice because it actually deals with sustainability, and it deals with the fact that we are hydroelectric and we're sort of off the grid a little bit. We're also the #1 law school for environmental law and obviously for animal law, and so thank you. And I need to say, it's due in part to some of the people in the room. Some of our alums are here, but ALDF is here. We couldn't be doing what we're doing without ALDF. And working collaboratively as the director of the clinic, some of my client organizations are in the room as well. So it's a team effort, and it's nice to get some recognition in the world, right, for the work that we're doing. And so it's beginning to happen. So, happy thoughts. All right, overview. Got to start happy too, right? So this is a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I do have a couple general notes. I'm going to focus, there's not a lot of time. I could spend the whole 30 minutes just on one of the environmental laws, right, and how it's applied in the CAFO context. But we don't have that kind of time, and that would be a little dry, and you don't need that at this point in the day. So I am going to just focus on the federal. There was a question earlier about state laws, and states actually have the ability to do more than the federal government, and in some cases they do. So it's good when you're thinking about strategies not to forget to check the state laws. I'm not going to go into aquaculture specifically. I'm going to show a couple slides on it, but that's about it. Aquaculture is something we need to be really paying attention to in the next few years. We need to be digging into it. The pollution issues, the harm issues to animals are just ridiculous. So I'll talk about it a teeny bit, but the laws around it are really not well developed, and that's why I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. And this is clearly not comprehensive, just so that you know. Okay. So, first of all, why am I talking about environmental law? Right? You might be asking yourselves when we're trying to focus on how to protect the lives and advance the interests of animals. Well, because that's hard to do straight up when we live in a system, a legal system, that does not have a lot of laws that protect or recognize even the interests of animals. So as animal lawyers, we get very creative. I did not go to school to become an environmental lawyer. I've had to learn sort of on the fly. I'm certainly not an expert, but this is something that I've learned a lot about how to deal with. So this is why we're talking about environmental law, because it does matter. This is what we want. This looks like a clean environment, right? This looks like clean air, clean water, happiness, right? Not overuse of the natural resources. This is what we're working for. And this is what we want to fix. When we think about pollution, right? When we think about environmental problems, we think about pollution. There's other ways to think about environmental problems, but we think primarily about pollution. And when we think about pollution, this is what we want to fix. This is what our environmental laws were designed to protect against, not against what we're dealing with, okay? And we'll talk about that more. So we've had causes for change in the environmental structure. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we got to where we are with our environmental laws so we can use that as some sort of framework for moving in the animal world, right? So how did we get from this, right, and this, to a couple of others, to getting to a better situation legally, the legal framework? So this is, interesting, Cuyahoga County. So this is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio. It's a relatively famous or infamous situation in which the river literally caught on fire. And not just once, not just twice, but regularly, okay? Interestingly, in 1969 is when this sort of really came to the forefront. And this picture, I have environmental colleagues who don't like this whole situation. It's the 1952 picture that they used in 1969, but whatever. The river caught on fire, okay? I don't really know why it matters when that actually happened. So this is a picture in 69 on the right-hand side, right? That's someone who literally just dunked their hand in the river, and that's what came out, okay? This was primarily, in this time frame, industrial pollution from factories, right? This was not from farm factories. This was petrochemical and other kind of factories. But this was pretty horrifying, and it went across the nation, that picture. And people were like, oh my God, like water catching on fire, that's kind of a problem. What are we doing? Then we also had a 1962 Silent Spring, right? We had Rachel Carson going, let's talk about the chemicals in the environment. Let's talk about what they might be doing to our bodies and our environment. And the fact that these things bioaccumulate. We're talking about generations. We're talking about genetics. We're talking about scary, scary stuff. And if we don't know what we're doing, right? If we don't know what the negative consequences are, why are we allowing this to happen? So asking really interesting questions. In 1966, it was the first time that a picture was sent from the moon of the Earth. This is a more famous picture. In 1972, it was the first full picture of the planet. And what happened is this had an impact, again, this picture went global. And it had an impact on public consciousness. People could see that basically resources were finite, that the Earth didn't have infinite resources, and we could use them up, and we could pollute them, right? And when they were gone, they were gone. And we did not have that in our public consciousness prior to this. We had this idea that science, especially in the 50s and 60s, we're going to solve all our problems, right? Better living through chemistry, right? That was an actual slogan, right? From GE. And so we went through this idea of whatever problem we have in the world can be solved by more science, right? More technology, more of that kind of innovation. We still have some of that concept, but then we began to think about what are the negative consequences of that. We have to actually start thinking about that because we really do have some precious resources and they're finite. Okay, so as a result of some of these things, we actually got Earth Day, yay! and we got the EPA, more important structurally, right? So that means we have sort of this consumer push, and a question in the last panel was, is this bottom up, right, or top down? So Earth Day is sort of a bottom up kind of thing, resulting in response, right, from the agency and at the agency level from the government. So when we're thinking about pollution, these are sort of the metrics that we're talking about, right? We're thinking about clean air, clean water, clean soil. We're also talking, importantly, about the right to know things, like what is in the air, what is in the soil, right? And habitat protection. That's the current sort of general framework of our environmental laws as they currently stand in the US. And so we're trying to protect people, plants, and animals, right? That's our ecology, our ecosystem. All right, so we have the development of a federal agency, the EPA, and we have federal laws that came online pretty quickly, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, right? So we had water pollution, we decided to have clean air, clean water. But we also have this philosophical and scientific framework, and so this is really important, this concept called ecology. This was a new concept, right? And so the idea is science is trying to solve some of our problems in creating more. We actually need a scientific approach to understanding what's happening. And so if we understand a framework called ecology, then we can decide what's happening to the ecology. And ecology becomes a concept we want to protect. So I'm suggesting we need a similar kind of transition in the animal world, right? We need a concept that can really frame things. It would be nice to have a photograph like the Earth, right, that changes people's views so you actually see animals as sentient beings, because a lot of people still don't see that, right? But it's hard to figure out how to do that, and there's an awful lot of images out there that should be having that result and aren't necessarily. But we need a kind of philosophical framework that says animals are part of our universe, and they deserve some of our protection, and their interests deserve to be respected. We have the scientific evolution comes from this Cartesian approach. So you remember Descartes, right? He's the I think, therefore I am kind of guy. He also said that animals were mechanistic. And so the noises they made when you experimented on them were simply like the noise of a clock being dismantled, right? So he denied the sentience of animals and therefore justified much of what follows, right? So if animals aren't sentient, we don't have to worry about hurting them, right? If they're not beings, then we can own them as property without any moral qualms, right? So the Cartesian approach to how we address animals philosophically, morally, and therefore legally is really problematized. So I'm suggesting, just like Ethan was suggesting, we need to talk about Darwin, right? So a Darwinian approach is, and it may not be completely free from problems, but at least Darwin said, no, we're not like, here's humans and here's the rest of creation, which is what we had thought, right? That's what Descartes would have said. Darwin says, no, here's humans and here's animals. We're part of a spectrum, right? We're part of sort of this system. We're all related. And genetically, we know that's true even more than we understood it in Darwin's time, right? We are the same. We're mammals, right? So mammals are pretty much the same kind of beings. But even reptiles, we have DNA that's alike. We have genetic structures that are alike. So if we can begin to see us as part of an ecology, part of an animal ecology, then we will take our responsibilities a little bit more seriously. All right. So the question is there pollution? Is there harm? So if we're looking at the CAFO context, that's one of our questions. These are pictures of cows in Switzerland. And so a question would be, do you see pollution? Do you see any pollution? Not really, right? Not in the traditional sense. Is there pollution? Of course there is, right? Right, so one of the questions that we deal with a lot in the environmental context is something called agronomic rates, right? So if there's too much manure for the ecosystem to absorb, right, then that may be termed pollution under the law. But there's certainly manure going into the fields, into the streams, so we don't know whether it's going into the groundwater. But it's an open question in point of fact. So our environmental laws were set up for factories, and they're not really well designed to deal with farms, and farms should actually be in quotations there, right? So when I talk to administrative officials and talk about the importance of not having exemptions for CAFOs in environmental laws, they say, but we can't deal with the effluent from farms in the same way that we can deal with them from industries. There's no pipe coming out that, no smokestack in which we can measure the pollution and we can shut it down. That's not how it works. It's like, well, just because that's not how it works doesn't mean it's not pollution and doesn't mean we don't have a duty to fix it. So that's the struggle that we face right now, right? So we've got a lot of good environmental enforcement folks who just don't understand the pollution components in the CAFO setting. They don't know what to do with it. So here we have our factory farms. So the other difficulty that we have, and here we actually do have pipes, right, coming out of CAFO. So if you want pipes, we can show you pipes. So we can't fix problems we don't see or understand. So right now, we don't really have a common definition of factory, and we don't have a common definition of farm, right? So what's called a farm right now is not really what we think of traditionally as a farm. So if we have a farm, then we shouldn't really be having lots of pollution. And one of the things to understand is folks back in the day, so one of the reasons these laws don't cover or weren't intended to cover farms is because farmers had an incentive to keep their animals healthy, right? And to keep their land appropriately healthy, right? Their water and their soil. Didn't mean they always did it, right? But if you have 1 or 2 or 3 fewer animals going to market because they're not healthy, that's an economic hit to a small-scale farmer. And that's not a hit they want to take. So they had an incentive to keep things operating a little bit more healthfully. That is not the situation with factory farms, right? They have an economic incentive to do the opposite, right? Because they're operating on scale, and so therefore if they lose a certain percentage, they're building that into the bottom line, but because they're operating at scale, they can get away with that sort of economically. And so they've decided to operate in an entirely different way, which is not a farm way, right? It's not the traditional farm way. Okay, so we've seen some of these pictures, right? So this is sort of old style, new style. And we have these new ideas about pollution that we're really struggling with. Another thing, actually, I should say, I try to talk to some of the producers as well when they're willing to talk to me, which is not very often. And try and understand what's going on in their heads, right? The middle-sized folks I have been able to talk to a little bit. And I talked to a guy in Oregon who explained to me that he was not a pig farmer initially, and he didn't actually know how to be a pig farmer. What was happening was he was farming crops in Oregon, and back in the 80s and 90s, there were problems with pesticides, and they were getting more expensive. This is a petrochemical application of things to the land, and he was becoming less and less able to afford the pesticides that he needed for his crops. So people had come up with this brilliant idea to put manure on the crops, right, which is kind of a really old idea, but hadn't been used, right? Because again, we had this scientific solution for crop management, which was don't do it the old-fashioned way with regular manure, create these pesticides, that's how we're gonna go forward. Well, the pesticides got too expensive, and the pesticide loads in the soil got kind of ridiculous. So he started importing some manure from a farm nearby, and then he decided, well, it was just more efficient and inexpensive to have the pigs there himself, right? And so then eventually it got more economically efficient for him just to have pigs. But then the poop had to go somewhere. So he actually had retained some amount of crops, right, to apply the manure to the crops. So he went in this complete 180, right, from being a real crop farmer to having pigs because he was making more money that way and not caring about having pigs, but still needing the poop to go somewhere. So he had some crops, right, for the poop to go on the crops. It's like, well, and he wasn't happy, right? He wasn't happy with any of that, but that's what he was doing. This is aquaculture. So the one on the left is the Florida Everglades, and the one on the right is China. The scale of aquaculture production in Asia in particular is mind-boggling. And I won't go into it a lot, but one of the things you need to understand is that they're in really vulnerable ecosystems in general terms, and they wipe out, right, the ecosystems. So they become dead zones, whether they're in the ocean or not in the ocean. There's all kinds of different structures that I could have shown you, but one of the things to know is that these fish are being raised for food, but we're also raising fish to feed to these fish, okay? So the cycle is enormous. And the bacteria and the toxic concentration, right? Of mercury and arsenic and all kinds of other things that are sometimes in the feed for the fish and sometimes just, as a result of other things in the environment, are so concentrated in those areas. And then these fish can escape, right? And then they can breed with wild populations and endanger the native species as well. So the significant pollution and environmental consequences of aquaculture, as we have it right now, are something really to be paying attention to. All right, frameworks. So comparing the environmental framework and the animal framework for a moment, we do things a little bit differently, right? So the environmental framework came about to fix problems that we could see, smell, and taste, right? We could see the problems, and that's what motivated people to say we need governmental change. Because industry didn't change on its own, right? We needed the government to step in and say, you know what, there are some limits to what y'all can put in the environment. And that's another way, as we heard before, right, David talking about externalizing these costs of production. It was an industrial focus, and it was designed purely for the benefit of people, right? We want a better environment. We want clean air. We want clean water. So we need to regulate the industries a little bit. And then we started thinking about the species as well, because we kind of like having the creatures around, right? So whether we like to go into the forest and visit them or whether we like to go in the forest and hunt them, we have an interest in having enough animals around for our own interests. It was a new use in legislation for science. And it used science well. It basically said you have to use science. You have to actually look at the harms in scientific terms. But it also balanced those with economic factors, right? So not in every instance, but in general terms. It said, well, we're not going to just go for a purely clean environment, because why would we do that, right? That's going to be expensive and shut down industry, and people will lose their jobs, and that would be a bad thing. Okay. So economic factors have to be balanced. The animal framework is slightly different, right? So we're concerned with the animals themselves as individuals, and we're also concerned with species. So in general terms, and so I come from a law school, right, that has a very big environmental program and the animal program, and this is one area in which we disagree. So the environmental emphasis tends to be on species protection, right? So if you have to kill a few of these kind of animals to save these kind of animals, that's what you do, right? Or if you have to kill a number of these animals to save its own species, that's what you do, because you want the species to survive. And that's a good goal, right? But animal law says, well, that's a good goal, but let's not kill the individuals either. Let's come up with a different way to deal with that problem. And the focus, of course, is an animal focus, and this is unique. This is what makes animal law different. The focus is on what is the impact on the animal, what interests do the animals have, what should we be thinking about in terms of the animal. And therefore, welfare concerns can override economic ones in our analysis, right? And use. The use of the animal is not a necessary part of this philosophy. So the animals, we don't have to see them, we don't have to enjoy them, right? Just knowing that they're there and that they have an interest in existing, and existing healthfully is enough for us in the animal world, right? To develop a philosophy and some legal frameworks to protect them. All right, alphabet soup time. So these are just some, and I'm sorry, they seem to have gone off the slide a teeny bit, of the laws that we deal with when we're talking about factory farms. So Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, EPCRA, which is the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, and that's basically letting people know what's being released in the environment. It's not regulating it. It's not saying you can't release it. It's just saying when you do, either accidentally, right, or you plan to, you got to let people know who might be affected by that. RCRA has already been mentioned, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. You think some of the animal ones are hard to say, right? This is basically Superfund, right? Superfund cleanup kind of thing. FIFRA is something that deals with pesticides, and TSCA is in fact the only environmental law that was developed in the 70s. These were all developed in the 70s that hasn't been amended since then. Amendments have been before the federal legislature for a very long time, but nothing has happened. And it actually explains, when we were having the conversation earlier about ractopamine, this TSCA, the framework of TSCA, explains how we got to that point. So in TSCA, and I'll get to it in a minute, but maybe I'll just say it, sorry, since I'm here. The burden is not on anyone really to show that these chemicals, before they're released into the environment, are safe. So the company comes to the federal government and says, we've shown in our clinical trials this is safe. The government does not have to show independently that it's safe. There's no independent auditors, and that's what happens. That's it, right? So they say, we think this is good, we want to get this out, and the burden is on the government or on the public to show otherwise. So after these chemicals are out there, if you think there's a problem with them, then you have to get the studies, and you have to show that there's a problem, and then you have to go to the government and say, to FDA or USDA and say, you should pull these, right? So it's kind of a backwards situation. And then obviously the Endangered Species Act. All right, so really, really quickly. Clean air, that's what we want. So this is a real summary of the Clean Air Act, right? So there's air quality standards. And again, all of these kinds of pollution laws don't say you can't pollute, right? They just say you can't pollute too much. And they don't necessarily work in tandem with each other, right? So they just say there's a certain sort of load for a community. So a certain water body has a certain toxic load that you can load it up with, right? And so it doesn't really matter who it comes from or what's happening. We're just saying the whole water body system can't be overloaded beyond that point. Up to that point, you can put in as much as you want. There's no incentive to reduce that load, right, to make the water cleaner or the air cleaner. So that's one of the problems with the framework that we have for environmental work. We also have state implementation plans, which sometimes could be good and sometimes are really bad, and others can probably talk about that even more. So again, this talks about, so the major sources of pollution are regulated, not all sources of pollution are regulated. So we're talking if someone emits more than 10 tons per year of a hazardous air pollutant, right? We're not saying it's already been deemed hazardous. And so you can emit more than 10 tons and then you become a major source of pollution. Right, it's like, who came up with this, right? Okay, so clean water, we want clean water. And these pictures are from the Columbia River, which is near where I live. This is CAFO water, right? We've already talked about that. Not so clean, not so pretty. And again, we're regulating discharges of pollutants, and environmental laws are really specific, every single word matters, into the waters of the United States and surface waters. We're not talking about stuff in groundwaters under the Clean Water Act. We do have the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so here, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System was intended to apply to these conveyances, but does apply to CAFOs. And this is something a lot of people have been working with. So again, if you can get a permit, right? So if you're a CAFO, you can just basically say, we're going to discharge this much, and it's at an agronomic rate. And as long as you don't exceed what you said you were going to discharge, you are okay. EPCRA, so this EPCRA, one of the nice things about EPCRA is that it has a toxic release inventory, and methane and ammonia are on that list, right? So methane and ammonia come from CAFOs, so we can use EPCRA to basically try to find out what's being emitted from the CAFOs. RCRA is solid waste. This little chart shows you, if you can see it, the green may not be really coming through, domestic waste, what's considered industrial waste, right? So we have medical, industrial, and domestic, and the ag falls under the domestic, and it falls under non-hazardous. And so one of the things I think we need to challenge is it is hazardous, right? It has amazing amounts of chemicals and other kinds of pollutants that we need to be thinking about. We could talk about point source. So this is just another chart showing that agricultural waste falls under so this is definitionally, right? Under the law, it falls under non-hazardous waste, which is just factually inaccurate. But that's what we have to fight when we're trying to bring these cases forward. So Superfund was designed for things like PCBs and nuclear accidents. And so you can understand why the folks on the Hill aren't thinking manure is equivalent, right, in terms of pollution concern, and yet we think in some ways it is. This is pesticides, again, trying to figure out what the sort of dosage of pesticide residue that goes into your bodies is okay. Not no pesticide residue, right, how much? And again, we don't have studies that say, okay, so if we've got Aileron, the apples, and you're eating those apples, and you've got a different kind of pesticide on a different kind of produce, right, or from the meat, what in combination does that do to our bodies? We don't have studies that answer those questions. So TSCA I talked about. And the Endangered Species Act, I would suggest that this is actually an act that we can use against CAFOs. People are starting to think about it. There's one Arkansas case. So we can be thinking about the pollution and the placement and habitat disruption, right? So when we're thinking about if a CAFO has any impact on an endangered species, the Endangered Species Act is one of our best environmental laws, right, to help animals. And so I think this is an area in which we could be developing, right? We could be developing litigation. And the scientific analysis, the biological opinions that they have to do to talk about the impact, I think, are going to be helpful if we can start using this tool more often. All right, some general concerns. So many of these laws have actual exemptions for agricultural operations. They allow permits for polluting. There are very few inspectors that go out and look. The industries are self-reporting, right? They're supposed to say, how much are you discharging, right? How much are you putting into the air or the water? And that's what we rely on. As was already mentioned, the USDA and the FDA, the USDA in particular has sort of a conflict of interest built in because they're part of their mission, right? Written into their mandate is to help support and promote agriculture. And this is what Ag is telling them they want to do. So their goal is to get them into compliance, not to penalize them. So even when we say, here's a CAFO that's violating the law, even the little law that we have, right? The USDA's response or the EPA's response is to say, let's get them back into compliance. And we're like, no, give them fines, give them penalties, shut them down, right? Can't we do what we do in the other areas of law? And the answer is generally no. So it has to be pretty darn bad. There are some concerns. It's really difficult. One of the ways in which the administration is right, the agencies are right, is if you have an effluent coming out of a pipe, you can measure the chemical composition, and it's going to be pretty much the same if the chemical composition going into the pipe is the same, right? It's not going to matter too much whether that pipe is in Arkansas or Texas or Oregon. But the geography and the climate and the soil absorption of pollution, right, of the manure and the chemicals is really different from state to state. It's different for poultry waste versus dairy cow waste versus pig waste. So, and measurement difficulties. So administratively, a couple things to think about. The FOIA, we've already heard people talking about. It really is our friend. The nice thing is, and if they violate FOIA, then we have some fees built in. We have some other options to pursue. It doesn't always work, but the consumers, we believe, and the public does have a right to know what's going on. Someone talked about NEPA before, and the mini NEPAs, the state NEPAs, they're good to think about, the APA. And we have to remember, again, that their goal is compliance. Our goals might be slightly different. We have some additional problems that we don't have time to talk about right now, but you should be thinking about. When we're talking about CAFOs, they rely on an entire chain, right, of other systems. So breeding facilities, we don't talk about. So we talk sometimes about the breeding animals, but we don't always. We forget them often, and they matter just as well. And the breeding facilities and the pollution they create matters just as well. The transportation from the breeding facilities to the CAFOs, the transportation from the CAFOs to the slaughter facilities, and the finishing. Pesticide research and production are really important. Animal feed crops are really important. And research facilities. So people probably saw the New York Times article a little bit ago with the Nebraska facility, right? It's gotten a lot of press. The government has gotten a lot of heat over it, so they even extended the comment period for information. There's more than that. So there's this place in Idaho I found, the Idaho Sheep Research Center, which the USDA decided to close, okay? But Idaho said, no, we'll give you $200,000 to keep it open. It operates on 77,000 acres, thousands of sheep. It kills wildlife. It's crazy, the environmental impact it has. And so right now, the Idaho legislature just at the beginning of this month pledged that $200,000 to keep them open. So we will see what happens. USDA's position right now is that they should still close. The good news, ending on sort of a happy note, right, is conferences like this. People are working on these issues. People are beginning to think super creatively, right? People are working in collaborations that didn't exist 5 and 10 years ago. People are working along lots of different lines, and globally, there's more conversation. So I am glad to be a part of that effort. I'm glad you're a part of that effort, and thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Elisabeth Holmes. I go by Eli. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more specifically on some of the environmental laws that Kathy was just mentioning. I will say that even though perhaps Lewis and Clark might be ranked, what, the 7th most beautiful? 8th? I think the U of O is the 7th. I went to the U of O, and so we have this rivalry between Lewis and Clark and the U of O. I do want to mention just a couple other things to build off of some of the points that folks brought up in earlier talks this afternoon. The first was regarding workers. Just about 3 weeks ago, up in the Yakima Valley in Washington, we had a young man who I believe was the father of 3 children drive into a lagoon, and nobody caught him until 6 hours later, and he had drowned. Regarding antibiotics, yes, there is crossover between the kinds of antibiotics that are used at CAFOs and those that are medically important to humans, namely tetracycline, penicillin, cephalosporin, and virginiamycin. And just in terms of how long this has been a problem, I went to my first lecture on antibiotic resistance in 1991. And lastly, there are things to keep on sort of the uplifting point that Kathy raised earlier, which I think is very important to keep going in this work because it is a tough fight. There are things that you can do to participate in this battle, and the fact that you are here today is one of the most important things. You can participate in the process, like Paige was mentioning, in part of the FFDCA, submitting comments. You can participate by submitting FOIA requests. You can contact your legislators. We need help right now regarding one of the cases that I'm going to be talking about on the legislative front. And on that point, I guess I would just ask, because I've heard that there's students in the audience and I've heard that there's attorneys. Would the students raise their hands? And the attorneys? Is anyone here from a state or federal or local government agency or entity? Yes? Indeed. And is anyone here from the Milk Producers Council? State or national? Now that we have that out of the way. First of all, I also want to thank ALDF for putting this together. So the potential sources of pollution at CAFOs. Oh, I forgot one important thing. So everyone else talked about their critters. I have 2 critters as well. This is Ella and Fig. Ella enjoys belly rubs and hanging out with Paige Tomaselli from the Center for Food Safety. Fig enjoys eating anything and everything and chasing cats. So again, this is the goal, just as Kathy was mentioning, you know, a more sustainable, productive method and clean water. I think it's a human right to have access to clean water. Potential sources of pollution at the CAFO are not just the CAFO in it itself. It's not just the land discharges. There's many different parts and components of the CAFO that are the sources of pollution that we need to examine much more closely. This is an excerpt from a settlement agreement that EPA had with some dairies in the Yakima Valley region, and it's probably a little bit difficult to see on this picture, but on each of the CAFOs you have the lagoons, you have the application fields, you have compost piles, you have silage areas, you have animal pens, stockpiled manure, the confinement barns. Each of these are different sources of different kinds of pollution, and we need to be looking at each of them more closely to work with the environmental laws to identify the problem and hold these guys accountable. And as Leslie said, sue the bastards. Because we know through years and years of experience that unfortunately our government is not going to be helping us as much as they should. Some of the different laws that Kathy mentioned are applicable here. For surface water, we primarily have the Clean Water Act. EPA regulations that implement the Clean Water Act focus heavily in a couple of sections on CAFOs. And there is, we have the ability to use those laws to create better practices. We also have some ability under air, but I think some of the other areas that we need to focus on are a little bit more silent and not as obvious. And they are primarily soil contamination and groundwater contamination. Just to look at the surface water piece for a minute, everyone has probably recently heard about the toxic algae blooms in the Lake Erie area. This is a picture from the one last summer in August. That's actually the third or fourth algae bloom in about 3 or 4 years. With respect to the groundwater problem, there's a lot of people in the United States that rely on groundwater for their primary source of drinking water. One of the worst illnesses that is known is called blue baby syndrome, or methemoglobinemia, which, as the slide details, really it reduces the ability of an infant primarily to oxygenate their own blood. One of the reasons that infants are more susceptible to this is because their digestive systems aren't as developed as in adults, and so they can't fight off the effects of certain contaminants in groundwater like nitrates as well as an adult can. And I will probably come back to this quote at the end, which is from a recent decision we got from the Eastern District of Washington, where basically the defendants had an ill-advised argument to suggest that they should wait until more children are sick before the court should take action on this issue. There's also, with respect to nitrates, which are one of the links that we have between CAFOs and groundwater contamination, a number of other health concerns that have been raised, namely as to reproductive issues and neural tube defects. The Center for Disease Control found an abnormally high level of neural tube defects and anencephaly, which is a birth defect brain disorder in the Yakima Valley area. Thyroid problems, there are some connections to cancers, there's immune system problems. People with imbalances on certain enzymes are more susceptible to this contamination. And again, you ingest it through, think about how much water you use on a daily basis for cooking and for making tea and for making coffee. And if you have kids, trying to control them in the kiddie pond and not ingesting any of that. It's a big part of your life, and you can be exposed to it if you live near a dairy on a daily basis for many years. The soil contamination problem is also something that is really important to focus on, because soil is important for the health of our crops. We are also relying more and more on soil as a method to sequester carbon. Soil protects us from surface water runoff problems, and it serves as a filter before any contaminants reach groundwater. And the reason why both of these are important is because, as Kathy was describing and as other folks have described earlier, we use manure from the CAFOs to apply to fields, to apply to crops. And normally, when it's used in agronomic rates, it is a beneficial soil conditioner. It is a fertilizer for crops. But the key is the agronomic rate focus. And so again, all of this is quite different from what was discussed this morning. But the key is internalizing the costs of running these operations. And this is the way that, that I've chosen to go about trying to internalize the costs. And it's only possible by doing this through collaboration with different groups. Like we've worked on cases with ALDF, I work with the Center for Food Safety, Public Justice. There's a number of groups that are interested in fighting these cases. And so in addition to all the different avenues that everyone's been speaking about, using the environmental laws is key. The reason why the soil piece also is important, going back to that, is that soil is permeable. If you've ever built a sandcastle or played in dirt, you know that if you pour water into a hole, it goes into the ground. And with the CAFOs, we have a similar problem. When you have a giant manure lagoon and you don't have a synthetic liner or any kind of liner, it's going to seep down through the dirt. And when manure and its elements and constituents goes, for example, on a field, when it goes below the root zone of what a crop can use to uptake, it's just going to continue down to groundwater. And one of the elements that we're most concerned about is the nitrate element, which is mobile. There's also in animal manure antibiotics and other veterinary pharmaceuticals that we're concerned about getting into groundwater contamination, groundwater supplies. The use of groundwater in the United States is pretty large. Over 15 million households in the United States rely on drinking water. Just to do a comparison between different kinds of places throughout our nation, in arid states, for example, in New Mexico, about 90% of the population relies on groundwater. And even in water-rich states, like in the Great Lakes region, around 8 million people use groundwater for drinking water. I'll also add that in the Great Lakes area, there's places that also use surface water as their primary source of drinking water. The connection between groundwater and surface water, I'm not going to get into too much of the legal permutations of that right now, but around 30% of stream flow in the United States is estimated to be based on groundwater, because there's the groundwater surface water recharge. Again, in arid states, like with the Rio Grande, I think the USGS qualified it as being substantially contributed to by groundwater. And in water-rich states, again, like in the Great Lakes, 80 to 90% of surface water in some area is based on groundwater, and I think it's Lake Michigan that might be 60% of it is estimated to be groundwater, but I could have the wrong lake. And so the concern there is that any contamination that is in groundwater can also enter surface water. So the main way that you can approach groundwater contamination has traditionally been through, surface water contamination has been through regulatory approaches, but most state permits and CAFO permits don't usually address groundwater. If they do, it's been in a relatively toothless fashion or something that's been essentially eviscerated. New Mexico had a great rule that would require groundwater monitoring. But the dairy industry came in, and now there's been petitions pending since 2009 to not implement that rule. So we need a way to fight that to get around it. And then other states like Michigan, for example, they will have groundwater monitoring, which is very, very important to, again, internalize the costs of running this business. But there's only 2 CAFOs in the state of Michigan that have 5,000 animal units or more. And so the way that the rule has been written has been designed to essentially avoid the problem and put the head in the sand, as Leslie was pointing out in her slides. Some of these concerns are regulated by what we call the DNMP, which is the Nutrient Management Plan. But the problem is, as we saw in recent litigation in Yakima, is that these are not followed. Some of the things that this DNMP does, which is the dairy's blueprint, is to account for how much manure are you putting onto the field, what does the crop need, how much crop are you going to be growing, and you need to record this information, and the goal is to prevent runoff of surface water and protect soils. So some of the examples where we've used these strategies to try and internalize the cost of the CAFO problem is in the state of Washington with a recent RCRA lawsuit. In Wisconsin, there is a petition pending with EPA addressing the Safe Drinking Water Act and RCRA and CERCLA. And in California, there's a RCRA and a state tort lawsuit pending. Let me just see if I have some. So the Yakima case is the Community Association for Restoration of the Environment and the Center for Food Safety versus Cow Palace, and there was actually 5 defendants. Now we're down to 3. Cow Palace is the first of these cases that have gone forward, and we had a motion for summary judgment hearing in January 2015, and we got a decision just recently. This case has been about 15 years in the making. There's been a long-standing nitrate contamination problem in the Yakima Valley that the folks there have known about, and they have done anything and everything they can to work on this problem. It included a number of Clean Water Act suits. It included reaching out to reporters, and I included in the materials for this discussion a 3-part series on the Yakima contamination. There were a number of studies that were done in the early 2000s, and still nothing substantive got done to address the problem. Finally, in 2010, EPA undertook a study of the contamination of nitrates in the area and also looked at veterinary pharmaceuticals and some other contaminants. And this is the model of why they were concerned and to show their linkages between the dairies and well contamination, because most of the people in this area are on well water. And this is EPA's rendition of the nitrogen cycle, with some of my additions to basically describe what we found to be the most important piece, which is you have at the bottom there's the crop root zone, and so any nitrate that gets below there is going to be going down to groundwater. The EPA's conclusion was, as you can see, that 58% of the contamination in the area was by the dairies. The irrigated cropland is also a major contributor to nitrate contamination in the area. This is just sort of a sample of what EPA's initial findings were and the number of sampling that they did. And again, this is key because this kind of data is not reported elsewhere. We really had to work to get EPA involved and engaged in this. And that's where you come in terms of advocating to get more monitoring and to get more efforts done to build this information so we can use it to our advantage. We brought the case under RCRA. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with RCRA, but basically we have to show that the defendant contributed to the solid waste problem. It's not there's no direct link that we have to prove. The standard is a little bit lesser. So with the results from the EPA study and the additional discovery that we were able to undertake in this case, we got a very good decision on summary judgment. And also for the kind of harm that we have to show, we just have to show that this contribution may present an imminent and substantial endangerment to human health or the environment. And we've got a number of, these results, you probably can't see the numbers, but basically a lot of them for that are for this study and then the follow-up to this study that test drinking water supplies is well over the 10 parts per million for nitrates, which is what EPA set the MCL at. The main two thrusts of the litigation are the ISE claim, which is the imminent substantial endangerment, and also open dumping. So that focuses on the practices that these dairies are undertaking in terms of managing their manure. And what we were able to show as well is, going back to the first slide here, there is a large area beyond the dairies itself that is contaminated. So we're able to figure out how to map a plume. And so that enables us to qualify for the open dumping piece of RCRA. So these are just a couple of the pictures from the Cow Palace dairy. Some of the problems that we have is that they say that their lagoons are lined, and this is not a synthetic liner. They say it's lined with soil or compacted manure, but as you can see, there's cracking. And so given the hydrology and given the soil components of this particular area, it creates pretty direct conduits to groundwater for the manure that's in here. This is another similar situation where something is supposed to be, where the defendants are alleging that they're protecting the groundwater, but actually there's cracking. And so this is kind of the underbelly of, I think, some of the pictures that you were seeing this morning, right? So this is what's kind of lying underneath and what happens, another side of what happens at these facilities. This is silage, and what happens is that it ferments, and so this is silage leaching off, and that could enter surface water or groundwater. And this is not an ad for a Chevrolet. This is those are manure piles. And in the background, you can see compost piles. So this is at an 11,000 head dairy. And it's just, there's so much manure that they can't figure out what to do with it. And you can land apply it and you can sell it as compost. But, I mean, it's just so much manure. This is an 11,000 head dairy, and I think the figure that EPA put forth is that a 2,500 cow dairy can produce as much waste as a city of 411,000 people. So you do the math of 2,500 and an 11,000 dairy, and I think it brings it out to like 1.2 or 1.2 million people. More compost piles. And animal pens themselves are also sources of manure. I'm sure you saw some pretty awful pictures this morning, and they're not lined. There's nothing to prevent any of this from getting into soil and getting into groundwater. This is a picture that was taken as I was in the Yakima Valley for about a week in May, and we didn't see any of these trucks the week that we were there. And then about 2 hours after everyone thought that we left, all of a sudden all the trucks were out applying waste. I like to think that they just couldn't hold it any longer. So we got a summary judgment decision in January. The basic holdings are that manure is a solid waste under RCRA. The judge found that over-applications of manure were untethered to the DNMP, which is the blueprint that's supposed to protect groundwater, surface water, and soils. Lagoons leak, compost leaches. He also found that human health impacts are correlated with environmental impacts. And the one thing that we definitely want to highlight, and you can probably tell by the pictures and some of the detail that I'm going into here, is that this is a factually specific case. This was the first case to find that CAFO waste could be a solid waste under RCRA. And so, I would just say these are good. Thanks. Well, we need your help in holding this, because while we got the decision in January and we are scheduled for trial on remediation issues in a couple of weeks, we know that industry right now is pushing for federal legislation to usurp our decision. So if you have any ability to contact your senators and representatives in Washington and reach out to them on this issue, do it. We're going to be hopefully putting together a little bit more of a stronger campaign and more direct way for you to get involved. But we know that there's meetings going on now and discussions going on now to try and take this decision away from us. And when I say us, I mean us. You. We have another case pending right now with Public Justice and a firm in San Francisco, which is also looking at RCRA and also pulling in some state tort law claims. This is the case that Leslie was mentioning earlier, where there's just huge amounts of fly infestations. I mean, there's pictures of young children just smothered in flies, and we have the complaint was included in your pack and materials, and if you look through that, there's some pretty devastating examples of how people in this community, which isn't that far from here, has been affected by it. What's interesting about this case, again, factually, is that the Water Board had been after these guys for years, and there had been a number of abatement orders issued to them, and they just ignored them and ignored them and ignored them. And now the groundwater was declared unusable by the Water Board, and it's because of this CAFO. So we won the opposition to a motion to dismiss in August, and now we're currently under discovery. And this will be another interesting case to keep your eye on. I just want to touch on two other pieces. I believe I mentioned the Wisconsin action, which is using the Safe Drinking Water Act. In that area in Wisconsin, about 95% of the county uses their aquifer for drinking water. And about 30% of the waters were found to be contaminated with bacteria and nitrate in excess of safe standards. I mentioned New Mexico, and let's see, the other main piece is really, about who bears the cost of cleaning this up. And the goal with these cases is to require the burden to be put back onto the producer. So it's the polluter that pays. And to change one of the ways that we plan on doing this is by changing their practices, like requiring, NRCS standards, which is USDA guidelines on how to build and construct these facilities. You shouldn't be building a manure lagoon over an aquifer that's used for drinking water. You should be using synthetic liners if you're going to be doing this. You should have leak detection systems. There's all sorts of technology that is available to CAFOs to protect human health and the environment, and they're just not being forced to do it. And that's what we're here to do. So that's all I have. I will also say that we were going to have Lynn Henning here today, and I don't know if anyone has heard of Lynn or met her before, but she is great, and she is an activist in the Michigan area. And I'll just show a little picture of Lynn, and we can maybe take a quick break for a minute or two and take some questions and then talk about Lynn's. Okay, so I'll just show a picture of Lynn, and we can maybe take a 2 or 3 minute break for some questions, and then we can, Kathy and I can sort of tag team with some of the information that Lynn was going to present. So this is Lynn after she won the environmental prize for the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2010 for her work on CAFOs in Michigan. And in case you didn't also see her YouTube clip with Bill, she's got a little section with him, and he was completely enamored with her. So this is, it's a really hot issue, and she has so much energy that she brings to this and has been doing it for years and years. So sorry she can't be here, but Kathy and I will do our best to summarize some of the points that she was going to talk about today with you.
So we're going to take some questions now for Eli and Kathy, if you have any questions. Anybody? You want one? Sure, just blur it out. Here.
So this is sort of like a question/comment. I think it's useful just to reiterate, I'm involved in the 2 lawsuits that Eli talked about, and what does this have to do with animal law and animal welfare, and why are we focusing on these lawsuits? And again, when I started first looking at factory farming and figuring out how to go after factory farms, it's such a difficult problem because animals don't have rights. The workers, by and large, are unwilling to come forward. It's very hard to put pressure on CAFOs and make them accountable for the adulterated food that comes out of CAFOs, the food poisoning and the animal flesh that's riddled with all sorts of pathogens and terrible drugs. So, how the hell are you supposed to go after these guys? And the single best tool that we've been able to identify is the federal environmental laws. And it's not a perfect tool. It's not a long-term answer, but it is a powerful tool because our goal is to make these CAFOs internalize one of the major costs that they have, which is their manure disposal practices, and hopefully by doing so, by making them internalize the cost of doing business, it will ultimately put pressure on them to, among other things, it makes it less profitable for them to raise animals in these intensive conditions of confinement. I think some of the worst problems with CAFOs come from the way they pack the animals in. That causes so much of the suffering, it causes so much of the overuse of the antibiotics and all the other drugs and so forth. And it becomes economically prohibitive to do that and to have that method of raising animals if they have to pay for the cost of dealing with the shit. So we're trying to make them pay for the cost of dealing with the shit. And hopefully that's just got to be one strategy among many, but that's what makes the RCRA case in Yakima Valley so threatening to the dairy industry. The dairy industry is freaking out about this case because it's the first time that that a judge has been willing, that people have really pushed. It's one of the first RCRA cases that have been pushed, and it's one of the first judges who's really been willing to embrace it. So the dairy industry is vowing to take this all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and blah, 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 and they're having huge symposiums and they're raising war chests, and it's really a big deal. So I just wanted to underscore, that's why we're doing the environmental law cases. It's because it's the best way that we can think of to help with the animal issues. And, of course, we also care about the environment, and we care about the people in these areas who live, who are living in the middle of horrendous conditions. And of course, the factory farms are in areas almost always, they're not in Beverly Hills. They're not in Beverly Hills. They're where the poor people live, the disempowered, the disenfranchised. So, of course, we care about all of that. But I just wanted to clarify, like, what the tie is to the animal welfare issues. And I don't know if either of the panelists have anything to add on that, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, I would just emphasize, if you take anything away from this discussion, there are a couple things that you should leave with. One is they are factories, they're not farms, and they pollute. And those are things the industry denies, right? And so our environmental laws are not designed to deal with this situation, which is why it's so difficult to find sort of good ways into the courts to use them. But if we can redefine and actually use facts, right? They are factories and they do pollute. Now we have a problem we can work on, right? If we can get everyone to understand that's the factual reality. And if you think about it in the terms, the quantities of pollution, if we're just talking about the poop, right? We're not even talking about all the other kinds of pollution that they emit. But just thinking about the poop, it's illegal for a town, city, or municipality not to treat its waste. It's illegal. And that makes really good sense, right? We don't want another Black Plague, right? We understand the importance of sanitation. But why do we not take that knowledge and apply it in this context, right? Their poop is no less sanitary than our poop. So if we and we talked about this in Oregon, and of course it didn't go anywhere, they just laughed at us, but if we just said, all right, fine, if you're gonna produce this amount of poop, you just have to put it through sewage treatment plants, right? Same as our poop. It would shut down the industry overnight. So of course it's not going to happen. But those are the sort of base realities that you need to understand. And the fact that we're arguing about that in court, right? Arguing about whether these are factories, arguing about whether they pollute, arguing about one of the other things that's great about the work that's gone on in Washington. The CAFOs always say, even if we pollute, we're polluting on our own property and we have the right to do that, which is true, right? If it doesn't go into a water of the United States or it doesn't cover the groundwater, right? So if it stays within their property, they're allowed to do certain things. And we're saying it doesn't stay there. And they say that's not true and you can't prove it because we don't get to go on their property, right? So that's another reason that this work is groundbreaking. So we're giving, we're giving the reality, right, to these lies, saying you do pollute, the pollution travels, it affects other people, and you have to start paying for that or stop doing it. I don't know if you want to add anything. Okay.
Mine's a little bit of a two-parter. Number one, you're talking about putting liners into the pools. What happens to that waste after it accumulates in a pool? And number two, what about evaporation? Do these chemicals go up into the air under the Clean Air Act or anything else? What's being done on that part as well? Because that will go to other communities and other areas.
Sure. So yes, it evaporates, and yes, people are working on that. Clean Air Act suits are harder to bring than Clean Water Act suits, which are hard enough to bring. But people are beginning to focus more energy and emphasis on that. What you need to do, one of the difficulties in a pollution context is you're supposed to try to prove the added pollution, which means you're supposed to understand what the base was and wherever it came from, right? And so that's pretty difficult. We don't have the scientific studies to talk about what level of nitrates were or ammonia was in the air, that kind of thing, methane. And so trying to figure out what the companies are adding, right, and whether that's a problem. And also they're allowed to do that in certain amounts, and it's only a problem after a certain amount, right? And anyways, long story. But yeah, it does go elsewhere, and people are having significant health effects. Obviously, the animals themselves are breathing, right, this stuff back in and having significant health effects, and then people are eating that, right? None of it makes any sense when you look at it from those kind of perspectives. So people are beginning to develop more of the Clean Air Act cases going forward. It's hard to get them up and running, but people are working on that. So really quickly on the liners, and I think Eli can add to it. So what happens at these facilities is they actually want some of it to evaporate because they don't have the capacity to handle all of it. Some of it they dry down, and then some of it they actually dry and they make it into solids, right? So you saw from Eli's slides, the compost, right? And so they try to find other uses for it when it goes beyond the agronomic rate. And I apologize, we've been saying agronomic rate, and I didn't really define that term. Like, you guys all understand what we're talking about, because we get used to this terminology, so I do apologize, that's my fault. So agronomic rate means the rate at which you can apply this to the land and it's beneficial, basically, right? So that it can absorb this material in a non-toxic kind of way. So yeah, what happens sometimes is then these lagoons are emptied if they come up with a different place or different sort of methodology. So they have the ability to spray this stuff. They put them in those trucks that you saw, right? Or they put them, when you guys drive down the roads and you see those irrigators, right, that are on wheels and they go through the fields like this, right, spraying, often that's spraying poop, right? You can actually look at them next time and see if it looks clear or if it looks dark. If it looks dark, you know what it is, right? If it looks clear, it may still be the same thing. So they try to reuse those lagoons, right? They try to use them and empty them out and reuse them. Some of them stay there forever, and they just build new lagoons, so every facility handles that somewhat differently. And we should also say, we've been talking about dairy and cattle. We didn't show you any slides of what poultry waste looks like and the difficulties for that, but just imagine they're bad. I don't know if you want to add to the lagoons.
Well, I'll just say too, like on the point of the brown water, if you see it being sprayed from the field, it just because it's not brown doesn't mean it doesn't contain manure or other things, because the way that waste is managed at the dairies, it can go, and I know mostly dairies, not that this is, and I just use that as an example. It's not to say that dairies are significantly different from the contamination problems that hog farms and poultry farms or turkey farms or whatever they are, and aren't immune from polluting. All different kinds of wastewater can be used at these facilities to apply to land and can also contain many contaminants. To address your question on the liners, so other waste impoundments not in the agricultural industry are required to line their pits. If it's, let's say coal ash or some other waste dump for the community, liners are pretty standard in most every other industry, and there's no reason that it shouldn't be required here. In terms of what happens when they get full, well, you're supposed to, under this NMP, clean them out and take care of them and make sure they're not ripped and make sure that they're not torn, so that you are protecting the environment. So you need to clean it out every once in a while, and if it means that you need to manage your compost differently, or that you need to apply less to the field because you're going to run afoul of the agronomic rate for the crop that you're growing, you got to do it. Those are just part and parcel of managing your business. And the dairies are upset about this because it's going to increase their costs of doing business.
And I'll add really quickly, for those who haven't already heard about methane digesters and digesters. I guess they're just called biodigesters. So basically the idea is there's so much waste, and they want to recoup whatever economic benefit they can, even from the waste. And so this concept of digesting, whether it's methane or whether it's actual solids, and turning it into an energy-producing source that can power the CAFO, can power, that can go back to the grid, maybe power the community. And so the industry's selling this as a really awesome kind of thing, right? It's calling it green energy. And think about what that means, right? That means that we're going to have this kind of green energy coming from more and more concentrated animal facilities, right? Because we're going to be producing more manure, producing more methane, and capturing it in a really efficient way. The good news is that the technology is not such that it can't operate without huge subsidies, millions and millions of dollars of subsidies. Some folks are saying they're up online and they're working and it's great, not without subsidies. They're not functional yet. They're not a good energy source, but even a lot of environmentalists think this is a good idea. They're not thinking about it from the animal welfare perspective, of course, but even from the environmental perspective, the hazards are outrageous, and they're not taking all of that into account. So just be aware when people are talking about those kinds of energy sources, it's not a good thing.
It's greenwashing.
Greenwashing, that's right, that we'll talk about more.
Should we talk
do you want to just keep going with questions?
No, I should do
Yeah,
a few minutes for Lynn.
Okay, so we'll take a little bit of a break and come back to questions so that Eli can talk a little bit more about Lynn's. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think so.
So how much time do we have for this? Okay. I'll do that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Thanks, guys. So, yeah. Go. Okay. All right. Sorry.
We're taking.
Switching speakers. I'm now Lynn Henning. Okay, so Lynn Henning is a resident of Clayton, Michigan. It's a small town in south central Michigan. Clayton, Michigan is in the Maumee River watershed, which drains into Lake Erie, which is one of the causes, one of the contributors to the algae bloom that you saw the pictures of. Lynn Henning is a farm wife, and she and her husband have around 300 acres of soybean, and they live across the street from a CAFO. And there are around 15 to 20 CAFOs in the immediate area that Lynn lives in. She's been concerned about pollution from CAFOs for a long, long time, and several years ago started an organization that has a very long name, which is Environmentally Concerned Citizens of South Central Michigan. And what she does with the group there is they started doing water quality monitoring because nobody else was doing it. And so they knew that the CAFOs were discharging pollution. They knew that they were causing problems. And so no one was keeping track of how bad the problems were, so she went out there and started sampling. And now there's a small group that do that, and whenever they get results, they send them to the Michigan DEQ, and they send them to EPA. So they're trying to get state and federal action to help them with the pollution, the water and air pollution that these CAFOs are causing. They're not having a lot of luck. But they have a lot of information, and they're doing their part as citizens to help the state and federal government do their job. Lynn also now works for a group called the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, and SRAP is really sort of a first response SOS community assistance group. So they're kind of a hotline for when a small community, let's say, doesn't have any CAFOs near them. Suddenly someone hears that there's going to be an 8,000 sow breeding facility coming in. And the community doesn't know what to do. They don't know what FOIA is. They just know that there's going to be huge environmental problems. They're concerned about the animal rights issues. It's going to change the way that their beautiful rural countryside lifestyle has been forever. And so what a lot of these folks do is they call SRAP, and SRAP has a procedure to help these communities educate themselves and vet what needs to be done, understand the permitting process, understand FOIA, get involved in the public participation process to have their voice heard. And I think that SRAP is probably one of the only group in the United States that does this. And so Lynn works with them to sort of offer assistance as like a first responder. Let's see. So their main focus is to develop community defense strategies and to help people organize. So a lot of times when a CAFO is coming in, it's just a group of neighbors. And so if they need to be more formally put together as an association or as an organization to have the ability to work together and get the attention of the permitting entities, then they will do that. This is the main focus of what SRAP will do. Their goal is to stop factory farms, and they do media, education, water monitoring, layouts, which is basically trying to understand from an engineering perspective and a design perspective how these facilities are going to be sited, where they're going to be sited, how close to a river, is there going to be any buffers. They work with agencies to try and get them to enforce the permitting requirements and enforce the law, and they help groups with organizing on the grounds. SRAP has been around for a while. There's a number of proven techniques that they have to stop CAFOs from coming in the first place. And this is some of the examples of what they do. This is the state of Michigan, which is where Lynn is based. And she's from South Central Michigan. I'm actually originally from East Lansing. And so there's a lot of the things that I've learned about the state of Michigan and water quality and how they're affected by CAFOs from Lynn, because she's a great source of knowledge. This is Lynn doing a major public records request. She spends a lot of time digging through documents and digesting data, which she then helps consolidate into more usable format for groups like SRAP and ECCSCM. These are different examples of how manure is applied in Michigan. The top is one of those big guns that Kathy was just mentioning. One of the major issues that you guys probably don't hear about here in California, but what we have a lot of in the Midwest and other places in the United States is manure application on snow. And whether or not that should be allowed, and when it should be allowed, and how it should be allowed. And the problem with this is if you put poop on snow, when the snow melts, all the poop just slides off. So it's kind of gross. And you end up getting a lot of water contamination problems from that. Michigan, actually, we just learned last night that Michigan is going to be introducing a proposed legislation ban on manure application on snow. They're going to introduce it, we believe, on Earth Day. They are modeling it after a law that was recently enacted in the state of Ohio that was a knee-jerk response to the pollution in Lake Erie. It's good to have something, but what they're proposing in Michigan, it's not good enough. And Jessica's actually reading that today, I think. So these are different ways that you see pollution occurring in the state of Michigan. One of the things that Lynn does a lot is just document and provide photos to agencies, because the agencies aren't getting out there. Earlier, I believe Kathy mentioned something about the number of inspectors. There's 2, I think, for most of the south area of the state of Michigan. Again, just, you know, there's so much that's near her, it's very easy for her to access. These are, I think the bottom right one is a hydrogen sulfide meter, showing pretty high levels near water. Again, going back to some of the things that I was talking about with in terms of the different sources of pollution, Lynn is mapped out, for example, on one CAFO near her that went bankrupt and that is now being reopened. All of these different pieces of the facility are different sources of pollution that we need to be looking at. This is a very unfortunate photo. More examples of pollution. And it's so prevalent there that this is why, you can see why when we think about these facilities, yes, we should definitely be thinking about animal right protection laws, but there's so much pollution that comes from these that we'd be remiss if we didn't also consider these very seriously as a strategy. Let's see. I know that one thing Lynn definitely wanted me to mention was the Traditions Mega Dairy, which is a dairy that was going to be sited in the state of Illinois, and SRAP and some other groups helped the neighbors organize, and they created a group called Holmes, H-O-M-E-S, which I can't recall offhand what it stands for. But what they did is they went through a multi-year battle to prevent this dairy from, I think it was a hog farm actually. Yeah, I think it was a hog farm from coming in. And they heard about it in 2007, and in 2012, they were able to finally get the final defeat on this. But they had to go through, as you can see, many, many years of administrative hurdles and battles to do this. They filed a lawsuit, and then they reached a settlement agreement, and ultimately, this is really a sort of a David and Goliath story. this small group won, and they really beat down this major producer that was trying to come in. And it's something that can be done, but as you can see by the amount of time that this took, it requires really for groups to keep their foot on the pedal consistently and hard throughout the entire battle. Again, this is basically how they were able to succeed. They organized, they were continually gathering information, they did fundraising, which is a major piece of all of these. Legal action, they addressed the permit, they got folks engaged. They did a lot of aerial surveillance and water monitoring. And the last comment she has about do not give up, I think that's the most important piece. So that's Lynn's presentation. I'm sorry you guys didn't get to hear it from her. Oh, and I'll just add that I know this black pig up there, I know him. His name is LB, which stands for Lover Boy.
And I'll just add a couple quick thoughts. So one is that there was a picture of Lynn and a small aircraft. And one of the things that the local communities have been able to do is actually do flyovers over some of the CAFOs and document what's happening. Because again, we don't have access to this, and we know the government inspectors are not sharing this information with us or worrying about it. So that is an incredible resource. The other thing that's really important about Lynn and people like her is she's from the community. Right, so it's impossible for the national organizations, as much as they want, to file suit in every community where this stuff is happening. It can't be done. We need people in the community because they know what's going on and they have a stake and they won't quit. And they'll be there year after year. But the other thing that's really important is they'll be listened to in a different way. Right, as a farm wife, Lynn uses her clout and her credibility to help everybody in that community. In a way where if I jet into a community, right, who's going to listen to me? Not in the same way they'll listen to Lynn. I can have all the same facts and figures, but it's not the same thing. So having someone who's really committed to that community, comes from that community, and can speak to the people in that community is critical. And it's something that Lynn has been doing for decades and sort of shows us how it can be done and how important it is. So we're sorry that she's not here, but we want you to appreciate her wonderful, wonderful work. So now we'll take some more questions.
A lot of the people that I talk to who consider themselves conscientious about what they eat and the treatment of animals and the environment often say that while they eat meat, they always eat, local when they can and organic and free range, and like to think that they're eating the happy meat that someone was talking about earlier. It's healthier for them, and I think from an animal perspective, it is the lesser of two evils, perhaps, that an animal can live what's closer to their natural life out on the pasture. So it's not a win, but it's something that you go, okay, well, I guess if we're going to do it anyway, it's better to be like that than in a CAFO. But I recently read that that's actually much worse for the environment, to have grass-fed beef and free-range chickens, because it uses more resources. And I felt conflicted about that statistic. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I was wondering if either of you have any thoughts or information about that and the challenges that it would present to this issue, since the environmental impact is so inextricably linked to the animal issues.
Yeah, so I can start and Eli can add. So it depends on what the question is that we're trying to answer about the environmental impact. So one thing I'll say first is, so this has been a conference about CAFOs, but nobody should be fooled that all the small-scale farms are perfect either, right, in terms of environmental pollution or animal welfare. So I've done a survey of all of the facilities in the state of Oregon, right? There's like 538 of them, okay? They're from small to large. And some of the small-scale producers are awful, right? They don't know what they're doing, they're neglectful, the animals aren't fed, right? They're left sitting in their own manure, they're dying. It's crazy, right, what's happening. So I certainly don't want to say all small-scale producers are like that, but it's not like they're perfect, right? And to a certain degree, if we're worried about animal welfare, they're still doing things that most of us aren't happy with, right? Now the question is, comparing, right? Is it better than? So assuming one of those happy farms where things are better, right? Is that better? If you're talking about, and this is a statistic that the CAFOs use a lot, they say it's not possible, right, to produce meat, and it's not good for the environment to produce meat in the way we're suggesting when we say happy meat is possible, right? That's not possible. And what they're talking about when they say it's not good for the environment, or at least part of what they're talking about is, we would use up way more land, and we would use up more resources, right, more water resources. There's a lot that goes into that, right, that we have to unpack. So one of the things that the CAFOs do is they say, well, we have a smaller footprint of land per animal, and that's true, right? That's true, but that's also one of the problems that we have with CAFOs, right? The other thing they do is they produce more pounds of meat per animal because of how they're feeding them and how they're genetically modified going in. And that's also true. So if you want to get a high efficiency meat production, right, then a CAFO is your thing. If you don't worry about the externalized costs, you don't worry about the animal welfare problems. So if you're going to raise heirloom animals, right, on grass-fed pasture, or pasture in the way that we think that did traditionally happen, you're gonna use more resources, and you're gonna produce less with those resources. So that's true. The question is, what is the metric, right, that we're looking at? So if we're looking at the environmental devastation, for pollution, that's still way better, right? If we're talking about use of resources, use of water and use of land, it's worse, right, in that metric. If we're talking about animal welfare, assuming, again, they're well cared for, way better. So it kind of depends on what you're talking about. The other thing that I find really troubling or challenging when I talk to folks from the industry is they make as an assumption that we have to eat meat, right? And so it's just a question of how we're raising meat and what's the best way to do it. And if it's an economic factor we're looking at, so the most efficient, which is what they generally say, right? This is what the consumer wants. And I keep coming back and saying, yeah, but all of your answers are predicated on the assumption that we have to or we should eat meat. If we're talking about producing plant protein that sustains human populations, we can shrink that down, right? And we can do more traditional farming in that sense. We don't have to do monoculture. We don't have to do some of these other things that have environmental impacts that they would say are negative, right? So that's kind of a long-winded and convoluted answer, but hopefully somewhat helpful. And Eli may have something to add.
Well, I just want to add that I think the figure that David put up earlier in showing the increase in poultry consumption was from like 9 pounds per year to 57 pounds per year. That's a lot of chicken. I mean, do we really need to be consuming that much as the primary source of protein? And I'll also add, too, that the drug that Leslie was mentioning, ractopamine, there's figures that show that like an average pig that would normally be, let's say, 200 pounds can be increased to like a 600-pound pig. And I remember reading in some of the ractopamine stuff that slaughterhouses have had to change the design of their equipment because it can no longer fit these gigantic animals that come through. Like, they just don't have the tongs and all those things that they use to slaughter the animals. I mean, the whole industry has had to change because of using these drugs that have increased. So, I would just throw those two things out to contextualize and to add on with what Kathy was saying. So.
And I would just emphasize Eli's point. It's a super important one, because when we ask the industry to change for animal welfare or pollution prevention, they say, oh, it's too hard, it's too expensive. They change all the time, right, to meet their own needs. And if you think about one of the reasons it's hard to make change from the outside in is things are really structured, right? We're talking about companies that build, right, those racks that the chickens go on, right? I mean, think about that. I was in a slaughterhouse in Switzerland because I haven't been allowed in one in the United States. Not a shock, right? They see me coming a mile away. And it was stunning to me to look at all of the machinery, right? And the buckets and the bins and the tracks and the trolleys and just the entire operation, right? And I was starting to look at who made these machines and where they came from across the world and thinking, this is somebody's industry, right? To make these machines, to do these to animals. And that's how institutionalized and below the surface all of this is, right? That we have to unpack all of this. But Eli's point, I think, is a really excellent one. If they want to change, they can change almost overnight.
I apologize if this question is gauche or too far afield. Just let me know if it is. But Eli, I think you're the only panelist today who's in private practice. And there's a lot of law students in the room, and I think we need to talk about these kinds of things for people who want to do this kind of work. These aren't damages cases. I assume maybe they have attorney's fee shifting statutes, but how do you do this kind of work and support yourself without the backing of a development department and rich donors and the infrastructure of a nonprofit?
Well, Matthew. Lots of caffeine and co-counsel. I mean, I'm with public justice on a number of cases, and I'm working with the Center of Food Safety on cases, and you have to co-counsel because this is a huge battle, and we need multiple sets of resources, both personnel, financial, logistical, and we're all busy people and have lots going on, so you can only do it with teams. And it's, you know, finding other attorneys that want to work with you and seeing what kind of resources they have. So you have to work together to get it done.
But it can be done?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and you should all be trying to do this.
I just want to add, so yeah, these are fee shifting statutes. If you win, you can get your attorney's fees under the Clean Water Act and RCRA and presumably under the other environmental statutes. What's tricky is that, particularly like the RCRA cases, it's really, really expensive to bring them because it's very fact intensive. We had to have, hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on expert sampling and expert reports and discovery and so forth and so on. So, that's why it's really important. That's why Eli needs to work with groups like us and like the Center for Food Safety, and we in turn are supported by a lot of generous donors. But it's difficult because it's very, very expensive to do this litigation.
Yeah, Leslie put numbers on it, and I wasn't gonna do that, but that's a perfect example because these cases are very expensive. And frankly, if the state and federal government were doing a better job at doing monitoring and sampling, then we wouldn't have to spend as much of the public's resources, private resources essentially, to do this. If we had better rules, like in New Mexico, if we had that dairy rule into effect, then the CAFOs would be paying for their own monitoring, and we would have that data publicly available. But they're not, and so as a result, we, as under citizen suit provisions, if we prevail or substantially prevail, you can get attorney's fees and costs. But you gotta build your case really carefully, and that's why you need experts. I will say that over the years there's been people that have said, oh, well, you don't have to, you can bring a Clean Water Act enforcement suit for, more simply. And you can, but I'm not necessarily sure, given the status and the precariousness of the legal position of a number of cases, I'm not sure that I want to be the attorney to take that gamble. So.
And I'll just say really quickly, it's getting easier. And think about these like the tobacco litigation suits, right? So you need to build the cases slowly, and you need to build the data. The thing that's different about this community and wonderful about this community is they work together, not just on individual cases, but sharing this data. In the tobacco litigation cases, those were private settlements, and that data didn't go beyond those cases. That is not happening here. So for individuals who want to work with organizations or on their own, people like Eli are blazing the path, and it's just going to get easier and easier for you guys to do it.
More question? Yeah, I just had one sort of technical question. You mentioned that Lynn Henning had, she had an airplane that flew over things. Has anyone used any drones to sort of document it?
It's a really good question. So be really attentive. So the drone, law enforcement around drones and legislation around drones is happening right now and is going to get even more important, and it relates back to the ag-gag stuff. So you'll see that, so the industry got really pissed off when they found out that EPA was using drones to look at what's going on, right, in their enforcement duty, to meet their enforcement duties as efficiently as they thought they could. But then, really interestingly, CAFO operators are realizing they can keep an eye on what's going on without even sending trucks out, right? And so they're starting to use drone technology themselves, which means I think they'll have a little bit less place to critique it when it's being used by others. However, some of the draft ag-gag provisions across the states are clearly targeting this because obviously activists want to use drone technology, and is it a trespass? At what height is it a trespass, right? We have some really interesting legal questions that are coming up. So pay attention to that. It's coming. It's already sort of, evolving as we speak.
And I think Oregon has, for example, has a law that's going into effect, I think in July of 2015, that talks about drone usage for commercial versus non-commercial interests and how that works, and you have to get a permit. And so there's, in addition to the ag-gag law, there's other, I don't even know if that falls under the transportation rules or where it falls, but there's other rules that you'll want to be on notice of to not run afoul of that, so you don't end up placing your entire case on evidence that can't be used.
We're out of time, but I just want to say we had a talk on drone rulemaking this week at USC Law, and the FAA's comment period is still open, so just FYI. But
I also just want to add that Will Potter, who will speak shortly, is starting to use drones for this kind of work, so probably have some stuff to add.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Nice one. Thank you.
We have a 15-minute break right now. Be back here at 5 for Will Potter.